you ready for an entertainment experience of a lifetime? Knockdown, drag-out, hard-hitting conversations, debates, and interviews. Well, if you said yes to any of these questions, sit back, relax, and enjoy something like no other. This is the Isolation Series podcast, presented by wellbeingsperformance.com for all your online meeting needs, and by imprintpilates.com Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area's premier Pilates studio, also specializing in rehabilitation and athletic conditioning, and finally by greenstorage.ca Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area's #1 self-storage facility. Here now is your host, Spencer Miller.
Hey guys, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of the Isolation Series. Me, Spencer Miller, very pleased to be joined by a dear friend of mine and multiple-time appearance aficionado on the Isolation Series himself. He is the Swiss Army knife of Canadian broadcasting himself. And of course, I'm referring to James Duthie. James, welcome back to the Isolation Series, my friend.
Spencer, always a pleasure. I always appreciate the gifts and the big check that you lavish on me after every appearance here.
And it will continue today, no doubt. Now, before we jump right into the conversation, right before we came on the air, you clarified that in fact is not an Ottawa Red Black shirt, but that is a vintage 1970s Ottawa Rough Riders shirt. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got it. I can't be, I do cover the CFL in the playoffs, and so I can't have a favorite. So I can't wear Red Blacks apparel, but I grew up on the Ottawa Rough Riders. I spent a lot of painful days in that stadium watching them lose 51-3 to Doug Flutie. And so I have to represent. They were my dad's favorite team. So somewhere up there, Dad's proud of me wearing my Rough Riders shirt.
Absolutely. Okay, let's switch to hockey now. Today is day 2 officially of the 2021-2022 regular season. Last night was the kickoff with 4 games. Tonight, I believe there's about 6 games, if memory serves. I wanted to start off by talking to you about a team that, to me, a lot of people are sleeping on, and that is the Chicago Blackhawks. For the last couple of seasons, they've been sort of in the abyss because they are very much like the Toronto Maple Leafs in terms of the fact that a number of years ago, they gave a bunch of money to Corey Crawford, they gave a bunch of money to Patrick Kane, and they gave a bunch of money to Jonathan Toews, rightfully so, but that put them up, not to mention Duncan Keith also, by the way, but that put them up against the cap and really, quote unquote, handicap them for a number of years, kind of like what the Leafs are going through right now. However, I believe that with Jonathan Toews returning, hopefully with his health issues under control this year, and bringing in a veteran proven goaltender like Marc-Andre Fleury, he can go in there and really help them remind people that the Blackhawks are still a good organization.
So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you're right about the comparison with the Leafs, with the major exception that they won a bunch of Stanley Cups. And so you can give out those contracts as rewards when you have 3 Stanley Cup rings. And I think you're bang on that it still makes it really difficult to build around when you have multiple guys making in double-digit millions per year. But I think much more acceptable when you have 3 parades to go with it than it would be in Toronto, where you give out that money when they haven't really done anything yet. So I think you're right, though. I'm not sure. It's going to be interesting to watch the Hawks. I think you're right that a lot of people have underrated them this year. If you think about how often do you get a chance to add in an off season the 3 most key positions, and that would be starting goalie, which they've done with Marc-Andre Fleury, as you mentioned, a #1 defenseman, Seth Jones. There are some analytics people that will argue whether Seth Jones is a #1 defenseman, but certainly he's got a lot of ability and a chance to prove that now in Chicago with big money long-term. And because of his health situation, Jonathan Toews. So you've added a Hall of Fame center a perhaps number one defenseman, and a Hall of Fame goalie all in the offseason, which just never happens in hockey. So I think you're right. I think they'll compete for a playoff spot in a tough division. They're, you know, a little thin in places after that and really young, but I think they'll be certainly one of the more fascinating teams to watch this year.
Have you seen in recent memory perhaps a Hall of Fame goaltender be so underrated in Marc-Andre Fleury? Because Marc-Andre Fleury has won multiple Stanley Cups, and he's been a Vezina finalist on multiple occasions and things like that. But during his end of his tenure in Pittsburgh, they sort of cast him aside. And then in Vegas, being the tandem with Robin Lehner last year, yes, that worked. But they pretty much cast him aside right at the beginning of the offseason when the expansion draft happened in order for Chicago to come in, sweep in, and get him. I have never in my time of watching hockey and professional hockey at that seen a goaltender with such a pedigree get so little respect, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I don't know that he's underrated because I think all of us as fans, appreciate what Marc-Andre Fleury said. I said he's headed to the Hall of Fame for sure. He's going to be right up there, if not number one in wins or and most of the big statistical categories. I think he's had a really interesting career, and some of what you mentioned is on him. He did not have a Marty Brodeur type career where he was sort of great from start to finish. Marty, in the tail end of his career wasn't very good, maybe the last 2-3 years, but for the most part, Marty Brodeur was brilliant start to finish in his career, where Fleury started out amazing and then really faded for a couple of years and then came back and then faded a bit and then went to Vegas and was awesome again. And then he had a moment. I think the reason it happened last year, really, it comes down to that one goal, that awful goal he gave away against Montreal that in many ways led to Vegas getting knocked out in a series everybody predicted they would win, which is not fair to hook everything on one goal for sure. So I think you're right. There was, I guess, a lack of respect, I guess is the right term, from the Vegas organization towards Fleury, considering he was sort of the face of the franchise. But when you have a Robin Lehner, it's a cold, hard business. And I'd say George McPhee is they're cold, hard people as far as analyzing things. And they had a great goalie in Lehner, and they couldn't have both of them. So they let him go. But I just think if we look back when he's done, it will be one of the more fascinating goalie careers we've seen in history because of what you mentioned. Just a guy who's won everything, but has also kind of lost his game at times and ends up in a situation like that where, still playing really great hockey, coming off of Vezina, he gets dumped like that.
Another team that's interesting to me going into tonight is the Montreal Canadiens. Obviously, they had that improbable run to the Stanley Cup in May, June, and whatnot, and nobody can take that away from them. And the argument can be made because of that. Marc Bergevin, one of the most maligned general managers in all of sports, probably has now got a new lease on life for at least another 3 years, good, bad, and indifferent, even though lots of people wanted to fire him on multiple different occasions throughout his tenure in that position. But also, you lose a legendary captain in Shea Weber due to injuries. You lose your backbone and face of the franchise in Carey Price because he is finally facing the demons that he's been dealing with for who knows how long, and we wish him nothing but the best of health and the best of luck in getting that. But they have a capable goaltender now in Jake Allen, who has proven himself at different times so far throughout his career. I just don't believe that they have enough up front to sort of compete and keep their head above water now that the divisions have gone back to what we know them to be. I think they caught a break last year playing in an all-Canadian division, And I think that a lot of Montreal Canadiens fans that were riding such a high from the spring, summer, this past season are going to come crashing back down to earth. What are your thoughts?
I mean, that's a fair assessment, and I've heard a lot of that. And I think I picked them. I think I picked them fifth in the division, and I mean, there's no reason not to do that. I don't think you can base one Stanley Cup run and suddenly say they're going to repeat it because of what you mentioned. I mean, last year they had the perfect formula where Carey Price was fantastic. You had four big defensemen, and that's one thing. Like Bergevin, you're right, has been maligned, but I think almost every move he made last year ended up finally paying off in that playoff run, where Ben Sherratt was an unbelievable acquisition when they got him, and Edmondson was really good, who's also hurt to start the season. So you had these four big defensemen all playing great, and the Nick Suzuki Pacioretty trade. Nick Suzuki's emerged as a true number one center and just gets that big contract now. And I even think this summer when they lose Kotkaniemi and the whole offer sheet fiasco to Carolina, but right away goes out and gets Christian Dvorak, who I think is going to be a really good, that was a really good pivot by Bergevin to get him quickly. So I don't think they're going to be, I think they'll battle for a playoff position, Spence, but I think they'll probably just fall a little bit short, depending on, look, can Carey Price get back? It's probably not going to be till for a couple of months anyway. If he can come back and be what he was through most of the playoffs, and you're right, whatever he's going through, that's paramount more than being on the ice and what he does for the Canadiens. But I just think it's the same old story in hockey. You never know if you get a goalie playing at best goalie in the world capability, you never know what can happen. But I think you're probably right that they're a team that competes for a playoff spot, but ultimately falls short.
Okay, and the next two teams we're going to talk about are some of the most infuriating teams for their respective fan bases. First, I want to talk about the Toronto Maple Leafs. Obviously, you, myself, and Paul, we all live in the GTHA area. And for a number of years now, since the Dubas and Shanahan regime took over from Lamoriello and so on and so forth, there's been a lot of expectation, and there is a lot of expectation in Toronto every year, no doubt about it, because it is the Toronto market. But they brought in John Tavares, gave him a bunch of money. They gave Austin Matthews a bunch of money. William Nylander got a contract that no other team, in my opinion, would have given him for the amount of play that he had at that time. And so they doled out so much money, as we've talked about. And now going into this year, you replace Freddie Anderson with Mrazek, who has had a good career, but I don't believe that tandem of Mrazek and Campbell is enough to carry that team into a consistent run to being relevant in the playoffs. Now, that could be unfair on my part, but I'm just saying it from a lens of seeing this team, give the city of Toronto a false hope on so many different occasions over the last decade. What are your thoughts?
I don't think goaltending is the biggest issue, really. Freddie wasn't great the last couple of years, was injured much of last year. Campbell went on that crazy run. I think a Mrazek-Campbell tandem is fine. Look, it's not elite goaltending, but I think it's probably fine. I think the bigger concern is left wing, where, you lose Zach Hyman, and they'll never have the depth that they were able to have sort of the last couple of years. It's finally all caught up with them now, and now it's going to be plugging holes with cheap guys for the next few years. And so I think the critical spot there is who plays. Mikheyev's out for a couple of months, and he might have gotten one of those spots. And whether you like him or not, he's frustrating to watch because he can never score, but he's a really useful player. That hurts. And it's these guys like Nick Ritchie and Michael Bunting and all these guys auditioning for the top 2 left wing spots that I think ends up making the biggest difference for this team. I think they'll really miss Zach Hyman a lot more than they'll miss Freddie Anderson. I think the biggest problem they have, Spence, is that the regular season doesn't matter. And yet it always matters because you have to make the playoffs and there's no guarantee. I think Vegas has the Leafs finishing second in that division. I think I'd pick them third behind Florida and Tampa, but there's no guarantee of making the playoffs. Montreal is still there. Ottawa will be better, etc. And the whole regular season doesn't matter. Like nothing they do in this regular, they could go 79-3 and it won't matter until we see what they do in the first round of the playoffs. And I think that's a burden on a team when you have to play 82 games and play your asses off for 6 months. And it's tough to get into the Stanley Cup playoffs. So you have to do that knowing that it doesn't really matter because all anybody cares about is whether you can get out of the first round after 5 straight first round losses. And so I think that's the really curious thing to watch with this team this year is how do they get through a regular season that really doesn't matter in the eyes of most of the fans? Because, you know, Mitch Marner could rack up 110 points and Austin Matthews score 65 and everybody will cheer and love it. But again, what they do in the first round and perhaps beyond is all that matters to the Maple Leafs this year. And I think that's tough mentally to get through a season that way. And to me, that's the thing to watch is if there's a letdown and they end up in a struggle for a playoff spot, partly because of that. So I think they'll be fine. But to me, that's the whole on left wing and the idea of rebounding off another, like the most shocking of all first round losses is going to be the biggest challenge for them.
Okay. Last 3 things. Switching to the other infuriating fan base that I was talking about just a moment ago, and that is Zach Hyman's new team, the Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl-led Edmonton Oilers. Obviously, it was a great pickup for them to bring in Zach Hyman based on his way that he plays and just being a gamer and a great teammate and everything like that. But for the last 5, 6, 7 years, we know that there's been lofty expectations in the West coming off of the Edmonton Oilers franchise, and they just have not been able to really fulfill that either. And yes, just like you talked about, they could have a great regular season, but it doesn't mean anything unless they do something of consequence in the playoffs. And to turn it to baseball for a moment, it makes me feel like the way that Shohei Ohtani and Mike Trout of the Angels must feel like on a baseball field at this moment, because you have Connor McDavid and you have Leon Draisaitl, 2 of the young stars of the game who have come in for the last 5 or 6 years and not really been able to do anything because they haven't really been able to get the right players around them to help them take that next step. What, in your opinion, right now needs to happen in Oiler country in order for them to be relevant in the playoffs?
I think it depends on 2 positions entirely. And that is obviously goaltending. Mike Smith is up there and Mikko Koskinen. And between those 2, is that second round, third round of the playoffs goaltending? Might not be. Mike Smith wasn't the reason they lost last year. He was fine. But that's question number 1. And actually, that's probably question number 2. Question number 1, I think, is the D. So they bring in Duncan Keith and Cody Ceci. And particularly with Duncan Keith, I don't remember a player whose the current opinions of experts vary so much on. There is one side of the coin, which apparently is, Kenny Holland's view of things and Dave Tippett, that Duncan Keith still has game, has that leadership and 3 Stanley Cup rings, and, will add so much to the Oilers on the back end. There is another opinion particularly again by analytics and stats people, but also by others I've talked to. Like some people think Duncan Keith is the worst defenseman in the National Hockey League now. So it's fascinating. And I think that'll be the number one thing. And Cody Cece's always been a player like that, that has been, in Ottawa, he almost got run out of Ottawa in the end. Toronto is sort of mixed opinions, but Cody Cece's a guy that's a lot of GMs think is a decent, valuable defenseman, and then some fans just think is terrible in his defensive end. And so Cody Cece and Duncan Keith, I think, is the number one thing to watch for the Oilers this year. And who's right? Is Kenny Holland right, or is the rest of the stats world right? And if it's the second thing, then the Oilers are going to be in big trouble. And if it's the first thing, well, maybe they can make a run. And by the way, I'll say Connor McDavid really wanted Duncan Keith. So anybody who just put that on Ken Holland and said, that was a massive mistake, Connor McDavid wanted Duncan Keith too. So I really think that those two players, Keith and Cece, and the goalies will decide if the Oilers are a legit contender or if it's another one of these incredibly disappointing seasons.
You and I have been in broadcasting for a long time. Okay. And I wanted to just get your opinion on this. Last night was the first night of the NHL on TNT, and the NHL also back on ESPN.
Right. ESPN last night, TNT tonight, I think. Yeah.
Right. My question to you, though, is they've tried this in the past, not TNT. This is TNT's first venture into hockey, I believe. And they've done a good job on paper as far as bringing in Wayne Gretzky and a few other different people. We'll see how it translates starting tonight. But we also know that the U.S. market for hockey and watching hockey broadcast has never really been there. NBC tried to do their best over the last number of years to put forth quality broadcasting, and I love Mike Emmerich and things like that, but it never really has taken hold in the States. If you remember, ESPN did have NHL for a number of years before this as well, and before NBC took over the contract. Do you believe that with these two broadcasting companies coming forth in the States now, that we could see the first successful two network partnership, if you want to call it that, for NHL hockey ever?
Well, it depends how you define success. I personally believe that hockey is always going to be a regional sport in the States. That it's never going to be what football and baseball are in the States. It's always had these pockets where it's incredibly popular, and pockets where it pops up. Like the Vegas success is unbelievable. But if you watched NBC over the years, the games every weekend were the same. It was Pittsburgh, Washington, Philadelphia, New York Rangers. Yeah, because that's where they needed to get their numbers from to satisfy their advertisers. Now, the one thing that I'm buoyed by is I think TNT and ESPN already have like many more McDavid games and the Oilers and so on and so forth. And I think the difference with ESPN, I always think it was a mistake for them to leave ESPN, is ESPN is on in every bar in America. It's on all the time, and to have, as soon as ESPN lost hockey, they didn't show the highlights. Maybe Stanley Cup final. I always see Steve Levy and Barry Melrose at the Stanley Cup final, and something crazy happened in a game. It might creep onto the show in their top 10 list, but it was never there regularly. And now that ESPN is vested, I hope that you will see hockey, in their first block, the first 10 minutes of their show or the first 15 minutes of their show. So can that make a dent? I think so, but I don't think, so how you define success? Could they get 10%, 20% more viewers than NBC got? I think that's definitely possible, 25%. For it to compete with the NBA and the NFL in the States, I just think that's a pipe dream. I don't think it's ever going to happen. It's a colossus in Canada. It's a regional sport in the States, and I think that's probably always going to be what it is.
Okay, and we cannot have a hockey guy such as yourself and a sports guy such as yourself on here without throwing it to my co-host with the most, Paul, for a moment. I know he's a big hockey guy himself. So, Paul, would you like to ask James any question before he departs this wonderful opening night or second opening night episode of Hockey on the Isolation series?
Sure. Thanks, Spence. And thanks, of course, James, for being here again with us. A new season brings like so many storylines, and we've talked about some of the really big ones already. Are there any storylines for you that are kind of flying under the radar that really have your attention, that have you curious going into the new season?
Is anything under the radar in this country? That'd be the question I'd ask, Paul. It just seems like we cover it so wall to wall on TSN, the other network, and so on, that it's hard to find something that gets missed, I suppose. I think Spence was right in his assessment of Chicago, that they're a really fascinating story that nobody's really talking about much. I guess I want to know of the Canadian disappointing teams last year, who there's a real opportunity for Vancouver and Calgary, because that Pacific division is weak. I know a lot of people have the Kraken going to the playoffs, and I think that's basically based on what Vegas did in their first year. I look at that roster and I see a lot of decent players and no really good ones. And I'm just not sure that that's a playoff team. Again, they looked okay last night. They came back and gave it. Yeah, go ahead.
Except for Philip Grubauer.
Well, that's what I was saying. You have a really good goalie, and you have a lot of decent players. Jared McCann and Jordan Eberle and so on and so forth. So, but I just think you need elite players to succeed in the National Hockey League. And so I'm not as high on Seattle as some are. So I think Calgary and Vancouver really have an opportunity to have, a bounce back season. And I always think Vancouver is going to be better. I like the core in Vancouver, and I think they're going to be better than people give them credit for. It's for Calgary, it's kind of you talk about, this being a big season for Toronto. It's the same for Calgary. If that core fails again, you have to break it up. I can't see Johnny Gaudreau being back. And the same with Ottawa, the whole Kachuk situation. Again, that's not under the radar. But if they get him signed, can they make the leap forward? So I don't know if this is the right way to answer your question, but I think that all the attention usually goes to Toronto or Winnipeg, who I know the TSN guys pick as Canada's best team right now, and Edmonton because of Draisaitl and McDavid. I'm really interested in, and Montreal because they were a Cup finalist. I'm interested in the three Canadian teams that people aren't talking about, and that's Calgary, Van, and Ottawa, to see if they can make a significant move at all this season.
I would say also, too, that Seattle has to be one of the first teams that I've ever seen come into a league with elite jerseys. Their jerseys are on point. I love their jerseys, and they remind me similarly of the Buffalo Sabres jerseys from about 15 years ago with Chris Drury and Daniel Briere that everybody was talking about and everybody loved at that particular time. I don't know if you agree with me on that.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. You see, I was a Chicago Blackhawks fan when I was a kid, and I still get a visceral reaction. I'm not a Hawks fan anymore, but when I see them in their whites, up close, that jersey does something to me, because I think a little 9-year-old Jimmy, how much he loved the Blackhawks. Like I do get an actual feeling in my body of excitement when I see that jersey. Yeah. And I think you're bang on, Spence. I think that the Kraken just nailed it. Just the color combination. I don't buy jerseys. I'm not a jersey guy, but if I was, a teenager or whatever, I'd be out getting that thing in a heartbeat, because I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Jerry Bruckheimer, the famous film producer, is part of that ownership group where he knows, we need to do something to encapsulate the audience right from the word go. And obviously it's not all him, but I would say that he had a large part to do with that. Would you agree with that statement as well?
Yeah, probably. I mean, he's an entertainment guy, right? And when you have entertainment guys near the top, it certainly helps. But I'm just glad. I think it's cool that Seattle's in the league. I always thought that Seattle would have been a perfect fit for an NHL team. I was trying to tell Mackenzie and Dregs that like 15 years ago, and they're like, the NHL's not even looking at Seattle.
Do you believe? Do you believe that now that the Kraken have started their inaugural season, we will then now see within the next 3 to 5 years the return of the Seattle Supersonics?
Great question. Again, worthy market, I think. But I don't know enough about the inner workings of NBA franchises and where they're going right now, if they're even looking at that. So I would love to see it. Like I said, Seattle, the last time I was out there was Toronto FC was in the MLS Cup 2 years ago in Seattle. And I really like that city. You know, it's very Vancouver-esque and really great sports fans. I mean, that soccer team has been one of the great success stories in sport. I think they made the playoffs like 13 out of 13 seasons. They get 40,000 people in that building for the games. It's nuts. So it's a great sports city. So I don't see why not.
Shout out to Sean Kemp, Dead Left Shrimp, and the glove Gary Payton.
Gary Payton.
Yes.
Yeah.
But James, we appreciate you taking the time, as always, to join us here on the Isolation Series. And we look forward to having you on again with us closer to the Olympics, because if you can believe it, the Olympics are just around the corner. And that's very exciting as well, to have NHL players going back to the Olympics.
Yeah, I can't wait, buddy. So thanks for having me on, and take it easy.
Absolutely. That is James Duthie of TSN, and this has been another edition of the Isolation Series with me, Spencer Miller. Very pleased to be joined also by my co-host, Paul Shields, and we'll come to you again tomorrow with another fantastic episode. But for Paul and James, I'm the better looking one out of the three of us, Ben, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye. Hey guys, thanks once again for tuning in to today's episode of the Isolation Series with me, Spencer Miller, and that guy right over there, Paul Shields. As always, today's show has been brought to you by wellbeingsperformance.com for all your virtual meeting and virtual needs, period. Please go to wellbeingsperformance.com, as well as Barbarian Steakhouse, Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area's premier steakhouse facility since 1959. For more information, including any new updates on their menu, please go to barbarians.com, as well as imprintpilates.com, Toronto's premier Pilates studio, and greenstorage.ca, Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area's #1 self-storage facility. For more information, please go to greenstorage.ca. And Paul, please tell people all about some more whole grain goodness that is us.
Folks, be sure to check us out on podbean.com by going to theisolationseries.podbean.com. There you'll find the audio-only versions of the podcast, including all of our past amazing interviews. One more time, that's theisolationseries.podbean.com. And hey, don't forget to follow us on Instagram. It's at @TheSpencerMiller and at Pauly Shields, Pauly spelled Pawly. So find us on podbean.com, follow us on Instagram, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Special shout outs to our newest partner in crime on the Isolation Series, and that is the Toronto Immune and Digestive Health Institute. For more information, please go to TIHDI.ca, and they can take care of all of your needs, from IVs to scopes and everything in between. Mark Silverberg and his team will treat you with spectacular respect and knowledge. That is the Toronto Immune Health and Digestive Institute.ca. You do not want to miss it. And once again, everybody, thank you for watching and or listening and supporting this thing we like to call the Isolation Series. For Paul Shields, I am Spencer Miller, and we will see you again very, very soon.